A genocidal social control agenda started in the late 1800s with London med school dropout Francis Galton, who wanted to breed people for better folks and do away with the feeble races. He used a mix of Greek terms to create the word eugenics from well-born. Of course, the aristocratic Brits who bankrolled Fran G were the superior race, and all others feebles. Fran G's books got sent round the world. By this time in Europe, new rich industrialists rose up against the royalty, and each side vied for the workers' help against the other, leading European countries to get national health care and a freer media, and halting eugenics in Europe. The U.S. didn't have royalty to vie with the new industrialists, so they had relatively unlimited power. Charles Davenport, founder of American eugenics, worked as a zoologist and had a Bible-thumping deacon dad who had only allowed his son to leave a God job for zoology when it became a big enough cash cow. At the American Breeders Association's first annual meeting in December of 1903, Chucky D gave his eugenics conclusions, finding most non-Nordic people defective. The top eugenics historian, award-winning New York Times and international best-selling author Edwin Black, noted Davenport's strongest conclusions related to the defectiveness of people of color and Jews. He called Italians violent and the Irish mental defectives, but Germans thrifty, intelligent, and honest. These were extremely precise scientific findings based on studying plants and animals. As for the eugenics funders, Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company to John Pierpont Morgan and turned to philanthropy. Daniel Gilman directed the Carnegie Foundation's first project, setting Chucky's eugenics up at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory campus on New York's Long Island in 1904. That same year, Congress passed government legislation allowing the Carnegie Institution and its eugenics research to be a quasi-federal project, taking on what they now called the Carnegie Institution of Washington's project shared in this Carnegie building. By 1912, the WASP super-wealthy families, America's oligarchs, including railroad tycoon E.H. Harriman, the Rockefellers, and Morgans, had joined the Carnegies in sponsoring eugenics nationwide. They bankrolled teaching positions in top universities, as well as campaigns for supportive politicians, and they funded doctors who killed defective babies, dubbed the Black Storks, and made into the most popular movie of its time. The Black Stork played at movie theaters around the nation for more than a decade. In state hospitals, they fed the feebles milk from tuberculosis-infected cows to get rid of them. The oligarchs overflowed with creative ways to kill. The Cold Spring Harbor Eugenics Lab offered summer biology classes for teens, and they made a young Mary Harriman so enthusiastic about eugenics that her Barnard College classmates called her Eugenia. How cute is that? PBS's American Experience recently covered Davenport's eugenics movement's highlights. The oligarchs continued to further their eugenics movement against imbeciles. Eugenics administrative leader Chucky Davenport assigned Harry Laughlin to head the Eugenics Records Office as his point man. Laughlin, who was spawned from Bible-thumping loins like his boss, acted on a dare as a kid and swung an axe on his brother's hand, chopping off a finger. Harry Henchopper Laughlin had received a degree in agriculture, botany, and nature at his college, the Normal School, where he met his wife, Pansy. For work, he then taught in a one-room schoolhouse before advancing to become principal of a school with 2 rooms. Aspiring to greatness, he wrote constant letters to Chucky and the oligarchs about how much he hated certain people. This appealed to the oligarchs very much, so they gave him a job aiding Chucky with eugenics, jumping Harry Handchopper's salary up to equal the president of the University of Florida. They soon had professors from Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Northwestern, Chicago, NYU, Cal Berkeley, and others join Chucky and Harry's excellent adventure. Chuck and Harry Handchopper hunted down people they called feeble-minded nationwide. They found white Roma people, Islamic blacks, and Native Americans. They found the Amish, who were too peaceful. They also categorized poverty as genetic, as well as epilepsy, deafness, blindness, criminality, stuttering, poor English, and sexual perversions. They particularly targeted people of color and ethnic backgrounds. The Carnegies, Harrimans, Rockefellers, and Morgans detailed 10 groups to do away with: the feeble-minded, the pauper class, alcoholics and other addicts, criminals that included people late in paying fines, epileptics, the insane, the weak, those predisposed to diseases, the deformed, and the blind, deaf, and mute. The oligarchs first targeted over 11 million Americans for sterilization or elimination, aiming for 10% of the population at a time. Heady days for the pre-Hitler folk. Chicago Tribune syndicated columnist Edwin Black has won many awards, including Best Book of the Year from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. He also won an International Human Rights Award from the World Affairs Council for War Against the Weak, which, along with his other books, have been translated into 20 languages in 190 countries. This trailer was strangely silent, and the film remains hard to find. Jr. took over the American-based House of Morgan Investment Bank after the death of his dad, John Pierpont Morgan. The House of Morgan had branches in New York, London, and Paris. That helped it finance Britain and France's military machinations at the end of 1913, when the First World War started. War was an easy new means of eugenics, in that the looked-down-upon poor could be sent off to fight and die for the rich, under a pretense of patriotism. By 1915, some crusading journalists exposed American eugenics as a war of the plutocrats against the poor. The Hearst newspapers syndicated a 1915 series of editorials typified by the San Francisco Daily News commentary on how railroad promoter Harriman, Carnegie, and Rockefeller were
devoted to sterilization of several hundred thousands of American defectives annually as a matter of eugenics. A boy is born to millions. He either doesn't work, isn't useful, doesn't contribute to human happiness, is altogether a parasite, or else he works to add to his millions, with a brutal, insane greed for more and more that caused the accumulation of inherited millions. Why isn't such the most dangerous defective of all? A boy is born to millions. He either doesn't work, isn't useful, doesn't contribute to human happiness, is altogether a parasite, or else he works to add to his millions, with a brutal, insane greed for more and more that caused the accumulation of inherited millions. Why isn't such the most dangerous defective of all? Talk about inheriting criminal tendencies. Is there a ranker case of such than the inheritance of Standard Oil criminality, as evidenced in the slaughter of mothers and their babies at Ludlow? Sterilization of hundreds of thousands of the masses by the Harrimans and Rockefellers. Let's first try out the defectiveness of the sons of billionaires.
Ah, the media's good old days. These kinds of articles likely contributed to, quote, J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, purchasing control of the 25 great newspapers, end quote, and connected top families buying controlling shares of most of the top magazines by 1917. Leading eugenicists had already taken control of medicine by this time. Around 1900, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgan families, led particularly by John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, had poured loads of money into the allopathic-aligned American Medical Association, or AMA. Homeopathy-based healers had organized the American Institute of Homeopathy in 1844, and allopathic practitioners formed in opposition to them, starting the AMA in 1846. As the older form of medicine, homeopathy relied on herbs and other natural substances for healing, while allopathic medicine relied more on surgery, mostly with saws, but also medicinal maggots and blood-sucking leeches. After the previously cited reports from the Surgeon General of the Army of massive vaccine poisoning in soldiers during World War I, the question remains as to whether the eugenics-minded oligarchs ever gave up the use of corrupted vaccines to diminish the population. While the polio vaccine of 1955 was hailed as a great public health breakthrough, many scientific studies would also make reports such as this one stating cancer risk associated with simian virus 40 contaminated polio vaccine. Decades later, these studies revealing this corruption pushed the U.S. Immunization Review Committee to admit that the polio vaccine administered from 1955 to 1963 was contaminated with a virus called simian virus SV40. The committee reported an inadequate conclusion, despite also admitting evidence supporting that SV40 contamination of polio vaccines can contribute to human cancers. In 1961, Dr. Bernice Eddy tried to stop people receiving the injections with these contaminated polio vaccines. Dr. Eddy was an award-winning virologist and one of the highest-ranking female scientists in NIH history. She discovered that this cancer-causing monkey virus, SV40, had contaminated 98 million Salk polio vaccines. Merck and Parke-Davis recalled their polio vaccines, but NIH officials refused to pursue a total recall of the rest of the supply. Authorities were more concerned with stopping Eddy than the shots. The NIH forbade Bernice Eddy from speaking publicly. Before the mob of critics scream anti-vaxxer freaks, take deep breaths and open your mind to a new way of thinking. It's a style. It's an attitude. It's a way of life. Conspiracy. It's not just a cologne. In August of 1964, the first shots were fired that officially led the U.S. into the Vietnam War. The event, later known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, was eventually stated as a fabrication. This U.S. Naval Institute report confirmed how once classified documents and tapes make clear that high government officials distorted fact and deceived the American public about events that led to full U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some of the same American companies that helped the Nazis in World War II helped Americans kill Vietnamese at a much higher rate. For example, General Electric created the fastest machine gun in history. It was fitted on helicopters and planes and could shoot 2,000 to 6,000 bullets per minute. In 1974, President Richard Nixon instructed his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to work with the National Security Council on a classified report, National Security Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests. The report included the policy recommendation of pushing functional assistance programs to create conditions for fertility decline. While women's reproductive rights alone would appear a worthy cause, such as different forms of contraception, this report never explicitly mentions them. Instead, it sticks with the euphemistic population program, talk stating that the Agency for International Development had an annual program which spent $137.5 million in 1975 alone. The report stated that some estimates noted that $2.5 billion annually would be required by 1985.